Chalian. So, David, just how divided is the country on this issue?
The country is pretty divided, Brianna. Take a look at this. Brand new poll numbers, CNN poll conducted by SSRS. We asked Americans, are the athletes that are kneeling during the anthem doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Look at this. 49% of Americans say they're doing the wrong thing. 43% of Americans say they're doing the right thing. Divided and leaning a bit towards actually Donald Trump's position. We'll get to him in just a moment. We also want to look at this by race and by age. And here it just tells a story of America, right? 59% of whites say that the athletes are wrong for protesting during the national anthem. Only 12% of blacks say the athletes are wrong for doing so, and 34% of Hispanics. That's the racial component. Let's look at it by age. Big divide between how people under 45 and over 45 see this. Under 45 years old, 37% say the athletes are wrong for protesting during the national anthem. Over 45 years old, 59% of them say that they're wrong for protesting during the national anthem. Now, as I said, we also know that Donald Trump has called on the NFL to put a rule in place. So we asked Americans, should professional sports actually require that athletes stand for the national anthem? 49% of Americans say yes. 47% of Americans say no. Again, complete divide. Where there is more consensus on this issue is the country saying Donald Trump shouldn't be involved. Take a look at this. We asked, so was Donald Trump right? Or did he do the right thing or the wrong thing in terms of criticizing the players who were kneeling during the anthem? Only 34% of Americans said Donald Trump is doing the right thing. 60% of Americans say he's doing the wrong thing. You rarely get that kind of consensus on anything these days, but clearly a healthy majority think Donald Trump is doing the wrong thing. And then, of course, we want to take a look at how this breaks down by race. We took a look at that. 51% of whites say Trump was wrong to criticize athletes for kneeling. You see across every racial group here is a majority. Simple majority with whites. 97% of blacks said Donald Trump was wrong. 72% of Hispanics. And if you look at the partisanship, of course, that is involved here too, Brianna. Take a look here, and you'll see that 86% of Democrats, of course, say Donald Trump was wrong. 61% of independents, the great middle of the country that Donald Trump is looking to court. And yet, also, nearly a quarter of Republicans, his base, say that he was wrong to criticize the athletes for kneeling. Brianna?
All right, David, thank you so much for explaining all of that. A lot of interesting numbers there, and I want to bring in our panel to talk about it. Joining us now is CNN sports analyst and sports columnist for USA Today, Christine Brennan. We also have former NFL player and president of the NFL Players Association, Dominique Foxworth, and Dave Nia back with us as well. Christine, that really stands out to me that 97% of African Americans say that, well, I mean, they're saying this is wrong for Donald Trump to weigh in. Yeah. He has said it's not about race, but the effect of the perception of it among black Americans is that it very much is.
Absolutely, and that's something we've been talking about all week. You can't get away from that. What really struck me, though, was that 6 in 10 Americans are saying Donald Trump made a mistake. I've got to believe that is a real shock to one person in particular, Donald Trump. And, you know, when you see the fans out there who are either saying USA or whatever, not doing what Aaron Rodgers said and link arms as the Packers did, and you kind of think, well, that must be the mood of the country. But to hear that it's basically a balancing act on this, I think is interesting too. And it really goes to what the NFL has done, I think, over the last week, which is to say, embrace the players. We've never seen this kind of unity between the union and the ownership as we have this week. And I think this poll proves that the NFL is doing the right thing, especially when you look at the future. Younger people, oh my goodness, who's your season ticket holders in the next 20, 30, 40 years?
That was a very interesting dividing line in that poll. Dominique, what do you think about this? And also the president, even though you have 6 out of 10 people, as Christine said, saying that the president shouldn't be weighing in on this, he's got a lot of support. Is he really boxing in NFL players with this?
I hope not. I mean, honestly, that polling is disappointing. But what was more disappointing to me was those signs. Because the signs that say that, and people who say that you should separate race and politics and things from sports, like, that is a form of, like, pernicious kind of supremacy in and of itself. And, like, many people, like black people like me, I don't have a choice to forget about the past. I don't have a choice. when they were asking me to come on this show, they asked how to spell my last name so I could be on this show. Like, I got my last name from my father, who got his last name from his father. But if you keep going down the line, like, it came from a slave owner. So there is not a time where I'm not reminded of racism and not reminded of this country's history. So it upsets me and it bothers me that people get angry that we want to interject a little bit of reality, that these players want to act as our country's conscience on occasion, and you can't take 5 minutes to acknowledge the injustices that have gone on and will continue to go on in this country because it makes you a little uncomfortable because you paid your dime. Like, it's disrespectful, and it's a bit of just unfairness that I think goes without, that people experience and don't even recognize.
Can I just say, I mean, there's so many different threads here. What we know is that a lot of Americans, the majority of Americans in this poll, don't like this form of protest, right? And we can have a debate about whether that's appropriate or not. Even if you've been watching the Vietnam War documentary that Ken Burns has done, that's so powerful. Even when Americans turned against the war, a majority did not agree with the tactics of a lot of the protesters. Yeah. Right. So because there was a sense of rallying around the flag. What Donald Trump has done as the president is effectively cast the NFL players, most of whom are African American, as not being entitled to make this protest, as if they're somehow out of control, and not, many of them, not all of them, powerful, successful, people who have a platform who are going to use that platform because that's their expression. And what he's saying is, no, you shouldn't be able to do that because you're disrespectful. And by the way, a lot of the players, as we were just talking about, are finding some common ground and saying, well, maybe we won't kneel anymore, maybe we'll lock arms to defy the president, but also to say we respect that there's a disagreement about kneeling during the anthem, which is tough for a lot of Americans.
Yeah. Dominic, I can just,
I mean,
every word you're hanging on here.
Yeah, so I don't think that we can have a discussion on whether it's okay or not. Like, that's not a thing that we can have a discussion on. Like, I hate to disagree with you on that, but I think that's part of the problem is that we're willing to have a conversation on whether what they're doing is okay or not. Like, the people who believe that players should be required to stand, like, we're venturing into autocracy territory. Like, that's not American. What is American is protesting, the right to protest. Like, we can go through our nation's history, and even as far back as when slavery was around, like, we protested, not us as black people because we weren't allowed to do those sorts of things, but we became a country from the root of protest. Like, I just don't understand anyone who would think that protesting is somehow un-American or disrespectful for the flag, especially when what they're asking for is us to live up to our stated ideals that we've never lived up to in the first place.
So there's this op-ed in the Post written by a member of the Army, and it starts out, she says, in the United States, our armed forces pledge an oath to the Constitution, not to the flag and not to any individual leader. That oath would carry me all over the country and to some unpleasant corners of the world. Nia, I hear people who are part of the military, but they are a minority when they're speaking as someone part of the military, saying, hey, we pledge to the Constitution, not to the flag, not to President Trump or to President Obama or to President Bush, and yet they have a minority view of, even though I would stand myself and I wouldn't kneel, there's this disagreement. So how do you square that if you have folks who are pointing out something which is true, there's a pledge to the Constitution, but the popularity has sort of their idea, they do not have that with them?
Yeah, I think it doesn't matter. We talked about this before, this whole idea of critiquing forms of protest, right? People didn't agree with the March on Washington protest. They thought that there should be a different kind of protest. They didn't like this gathering, the language of the day, a gathering of 200,000 Negroes in the Capitol in 1963. So this idea
history,
that's
not what history has preserved, right?
Exactly. Now it seems like, oh, of course, this was inevitable and this was a peaceful gathering that everybody agreed with.
And it's upheld. I mean, it's upheld.
Yeah, and this idea, I think there has been a bit of hijacking of the military, right? This idea that people in the military is incredibly diverse. It's about 40% non-white. The idea that people in the military don't have an investment and a voice in racial equality, right? I mean, and there are African American service members, white service members, Latino service members, all sorts of service members who have a stake in speaking out against some of these things that people in the NFL are talking about, and you've seen the sort of hijacking of the imagery. Pat Tillman, for instance, a lot of those images going around, Pat Tillman's family coming out and saying, don't politicize the death of Pat Tillman for political gain. And so, it's a complicated issue, race, patriotism, and I think too often it has been a thread throughout this country, painting African Americans as unpatriotic. When you think about somebody, those students who were in the civil rights movement, they were calling on American ideals in the original documents for Americans to live up to those ideals.
I think that this poll, though, going back to this, I think some of these numbers really, for those of us who've been talking about this for a week straight, I'm really surprised. I think there are positive signs for those players who are protesting. The nation is not against them 60%. This was basically, it's basically split within the margin of error, actually. We were talking about that. So I have no idea, and polls are polls, right? Nonetheless, here we are. This is the snapshot that we're looking at right now. And the fact that, again, 6 out of 10 Americans are saying Trump is wrong, I think that's shocking news to the White House. That's going to be my guess. And I think it's heartening news to the players. I realize that there's other things you would want to see, but I also think because the fact that Trump has inserted himself, there are people who might not have been on the side of kneeling players who are now saying, I want to see them protest because they're protesting against Trump, which is, of course, in many ways diluting the argument, but it also is bringing people
because that's not what the players are.
Exactly.
I have one final question. I want to put it to you, Dominique. When you heard the president say, as a former player yourself, he said, he's talked to owners and he thinks they're afraid of the players, that essentially they are sort of just kind of going along with it because they're afraid. What is your reaction?
I mean, it's dog whistle. I think everyone recognizes
is it even a dog whistle? It's pretty loud.
It's certainly not. It's a pretty loud dog whistle that we all seem to be able to hear, except for President Trump. So it's unfortunate and it's disappointing. But
as a player, when you hear the president, as a former player or as a current player, what is the first thing you think when you hear that?
I've talked to lots of players who, one of which said he was brought to tears by hearing that. But I can't say that I was that disappointed or surprised. It's hard for me to be surprised by what he says or does up until this point. Like, this is no more egregious than the plenty of other things that he said about other groups. It's a problem, obviously, but I think what's more scary, and I understand that we see some progress from those polls, but it's so scary to me that anybody in our country believes that the things that the players are doing, the players are acting as our conscience. Like, this country is hooked on this pernicious drug of racism and has been for so long, and the players are trying to help us, bring us to an intervention, and the response is like, no, I want to have fun and watch football. Like, that's the wrong response when you are faced with that.
But part of protesting and part of taking a stand is not the expectation that it's going to be universally embraced.
Right.
It rarely
is the stance, the importance is the protest. Not everybody's going to agree with the form or the substance of it. That shouldn't matter.
I don't think that people disagree with the form as much as they disagree with the substance, and then they find something in the form to disagree with. So I think that's what it comes down to.
I think there are people who do disagree with the form, that they think it's an inappropriate way to register that form of protest. I think that can be a legitimate reaction.
I think they want to talk about the substance.
I think that they've convinced themselves. Like, I think a lot of people come to decisions by instinct and immediately, and then they find some rationale to support that. Excuse me, without them even knowing it. I think that's what's happening. They see black players kneeling during the national anthem, and they're angry, and then they look for some reason to hate it. Like, it happens all the time throughout our history, where you find some reason to undercut the cause because you hate the cause, but you find some other shield to use and say it's about the form of protest. I just don't believe that they actually care about the form of protest. And you can look at the numbers to support it. Like, I think sports is a perfect place for this discussion, because where else are we so biased? Like, the Packers fans may see a play quite differently than a Bears fan. This is the same thing. We saw the racial numbers. Right. Like, black people seem to see this a lot differently. But it's also an appropriate place
because it's so diverse.
Absolutely.
It's like legitimately diverse. So,
David, Nia, Dominique, Christine, thank you so much. And not full agreement in this conversation. Certainly there isn't over the topic of it. Thank you to all of you. Coming